Hey guys, we have a special offer for Radio Rothbard listeners. Ryan has a new book out, Breaking Away, The Case for Secession, Radical Decentralization and Smaller Polities. Again, this is the secession book you need. I know it's a topic that a lot of you guys are interested in, always a big winner when we have it on the site in our podcasts. And you can get a discount on your copy of this book using the promo code ROTHPOD, that is ROTHPOD. The book just came out. We debuted it at our 40th anniversary event. Ryan has a great talk on the subject. Check it out at our YouTube channel. Everywhere else you can get your Mises Institute content. And so again, that is promo code ROTHPOD, ROTHPOD, and you'll get a 20% off discount on your order.
Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken. I'm a senior editor at the Mises Institute. And with me today, as usual, is my co-host and associate editor, Tho Bishop. And we brought in today Chris Calton. Now, Chris has been associated with the Mises Institute for a while. He's a historian. I met him at Mises U a few years ago. And he's done a number of audio podcasts for Mises.org. He's wrapping up his PhD these days. I would consider him an expert on American political and regulatory history in some ways. He probably wouldn't consider himself that, but because they teach you in graduate school, you don't know anything. But I think you're okay. I think you have some expertise. But what he's written on this time is on higher ed, and the whole series of higher ed that's currently on Mises.org. And I want to talk about some of these articles. And there's a four-parter, and really just exploring some of the different problems with higher ed. And we've, of course, looked at it in economic elements, and he has an economic dimension to the issue of loans there. But I actually want to start out with the first article that he published on the topic. And that was on really just kind of the culture behind going to college and what people expect out of it and why there's this expectation that you should go and why people are willing to spend so much money on it. And so maybe, Chris, maybe you can just give us a quick summary of what the basic issue is here behind your article, which is titled, by the way, in case you're looking for it, as College as an Economic and Social Problem Dealing with the Culture. So what were you trying to tell us with this article?
Sure. So this is one that I wanted to start with it because I think it's the most important overlooked element of the college problem, which is kind of outside politics. And I kind of wanted to make the point that while policy and politics are important and do affect this, there is a cultural element that just comes largely in the form of how parents and other authority figures are advising their children before college. And I was kind of contrasting the culture of going to college with the culture of getting a job. It's like a part-time job when you're in high school or even while you're attending college. And the point that I was trying to make is the way middle-class culture is kind of developed is where we treat college as this experience, right? And we justify this in different ways. We want to cultivate good citizens or whatever. We just want to get this broad array of knowledge that we kind of associate with any undergraduate degree, no matter the emphasis. And so it kind of became this euphemism of the college experience. And we compare this with one element of advice that I hear from my parents. Didn't give me this advice, but I know a lot of people who did, who tell their kids, don't get a job when you're in high school or when you're in college because school is your job. And this is kind of a development out of this rising middle-class prosperity in the second half of the 20th century where kids could do that, right? Which for a long time was something that only the wealthy were able to do. So it's understandable, this instinct of wanting to, once you're in that position, to encourage your children to focus on school rather than work. It's kind of a modern luxury, but that doesn't mean that it's good advice. And so what I'm suggesting is that we should actually treat getting a job as the experience that we should encourage our kids to have. You need to learn how to apply for jobs. You need to build up that work experience so that when you do reach the job market and you're looking for a career, you don't, like the friend I talk about in the article I have, who had a biology degree, is very intelligent, and got her first job at 23 part-time at Bed Bath & Beyond. Right? It's a STEM degree, by the way, that she had. May not have been programming, but still wasn't, feminine studies either. And so this is a major problem, whereas we should treat college as an economic decision, which is to say that we should be thinking not in terms of experience or well-rounded citizenship, but in terms of cost and long-term returns. Because we do need some college-educated people. We do need engineers and doctors with higher, I don't want an autodidactic doctor performing surgery on me. So we do need this higher education, but the problem is this culture builds in this surplus of college students, of people that are going there just to get drunk, get laid, and watch football. Sorry, Tho, I know you love football, but it's not a good reason to go to college. And that's driving up the tuition costs, even for the doctors and the engineers and the computer programmers that we do need. So it's a problem that has the spillover effect. So instead of treating college as an experience and work as an economic decision, I'm encouraging people in this article to do the reverse of that, largely in how you advise your children.
Well, and I think a point that can always be made, too, is that, of course, college is not this homogeneous thing, right? Is that there's so many different ways of going about it. And you note this a little bit in your article, right? Is that you could start out at community college and save yourself a boatload of money. And I used to be a lobbyist on higher ed policy, like 20 years ago. And one of the actual good pieces of legislation that was done in those days was legislation to guarantee the transfer of certain community college classes up to any state four-year school. So there's a list of classes. I can take Intro to American History, and we know it's going to be basically the same thing as any Intro to American History class. I take it. I'm guaranteed that's going to transfer up, and then I never have to look back. That's done. It's over. I just saved myself a bunch of money because the tuition costs at a community college are like half, if that, of what they are at some of these larger four-year schools. So you saved yourself a bunch of money there. If you go and you should do at least a year of school at a community college, unless you have some very specific program, right, that's very self-contained. And when you talk about and when you talk about jobs, right, this feeds into the whole heterogeneity thing about college too, right? Is most majors you could easily have a job and also major or even double major, right? Now I don't know, even the engineering students I knew had summer jobs. I don't know if they thought they could get away with working during the school year, but those programs actually were 4.5 years worth of credit. I think they crammed it into 4 years in most cases. But that's not what most people were majoring in. And of course, a lot of people then, they had like a poli-sci major, but still weren't working and still took 4 years to graduate, which you don't really need to get an undergraduate in political science. So again, right, you don't have to do it in 4 years. Could easily do it in 3 years just by taking courses during the summer, taking 18 hours during the semester instead of just 15 or 12, which most people do, so they could slack off and drink more and all of that stuff. And of course, you could start out at the community college. You could do tests to get out of some courses. I mean, there's all sorts of different strategies you can do. But as you note, so many people are wedded to this idea of the 4-year experience. And it's really quite remarkable then how much money and time, I mean, just that extra year, right, that gets poured into that, the huge opportunity costs. So it really is quite remarkable. And part of the reason I liked my wife when I met her senior year in college, was she had 2 jobs. And it was actually remarkable how many people didn't work at all at CU. And so I thought, hey, here's a woman with 2 jobs. This she's not gonna blow all of our money. That's someone who's good with money and not afraid to work. And there really is a difference, I think, in a lot of cases when a student either has to work or chooses to work. But you're right; they get that bad advice. If I give any advice to my kids are now getting to about college age. one thing I should have done was more internships and more like job type stuff being out there. And I was an econ major too. So, I mean, we had tons of people trying to recruit us and stuff out of undergrad, but I mean, I don't know. I didn't know much about how people worked in an office and stuff. So I kind of feel like I wasted a lot of that time. So what did I pay for? I mean, there were some good classes. I did learn some stuff, but I don't know. I think your critique is largely correct. It's just, I think some people then take it too far where they're like, well, there's all these people who just waste their time in college taking stupid, useless degrees, and then they get out and they don't make any money. They should have just become plumbers and stuff. But I mean, not all college experiences are the same. And I think we've all known those people too, who actually work real hard. And because their parents don't help them out or anything, so they work in addition to going to school. Or some people, you might go to one of those colleges that's like in a downtown. So I know CU Denver's this way, and IUPUI, part of the Indiana University system's this way, where it's like downtown and it's like catering to working adults and that sort of thing. So it assumes that people are working and trying to cram in school and all that. So there are different models, but it seems we're still very much wedded to this older model that you describe.
Well, it's interesting too, because when you look at kind of the raw numbers, I was kind of looking around for, what's the rate of college placement for like high school graduates and how that's changed over time. And I found a New York Times report, it's a few years old now, but if you look at like the 80s, the college placement for high school grads, was around 50%. After 2009, 2010s, I mean, that gets up to 70. I also wonder if there's a dynamic. For one, I think one of the things fueling this is that, there is an economic component, I think, particularly when you consider kind of like post 2008, 2009. I know if you look kind of broadly, like you look at Europe trends, for example, you had a massive high of like youth unemployment over there. We had a little bit of, we had a similar, but not quite the same scale tick up here. I wonder how much of just kind of the post financial crisis economic environment, if you have the opportunities, and I know we can talk a little bit about the student loan aspect and the financing and the way that changes behavior on top of the cultural side. That's a kind of very dangerous combination of everything that you're told by your guidance counselor or pop culture mixed with a government program incentivizing that same behavior. But I wonder how much of that is if you are depressed about major job prospects on the market. The viability of college looks greater and greater. I think that also kind of plays the role in the number of people that have gone back for that sort of bite at the apple with graduate school, particularly for some of the less obvious majors. But there is. I think a part of this is just again the continuing damage of 2008 and that financial crisis that I don't know if we've ever clawed ourselves out of. And luckily, we now get to see perhaps a repeat of some of those things and the structural consequences from there as well, with some of the interesting headlines out there in the modern economic environment.
Yeah, well, that timing that you mentioned also coincides with the nationalization of the student loan program. So I'm sure there's an economic component in that. Suddenly you have undeniable loans, or loans that can't be denied, I guess, that students have available to them. Of course, colleges are going to be a bit more liberal in their admissions process, and we're going to see fewer students turned down because they're being less selective, because they want those federal dollars. They can hike up their tuition costs. We, of course, have seen that tuition costs have skyrocketed. The more we subsidize them, the more expensive it gets. What a shock. So I'm sure that timing has something to do with it as well. The complete, and this is, what I talk about in the second article, is the complete nationalization of student loans took place in 2010. And this is the thing that I think drives me most crazy about the college problem in the political conversation, because Democrats lie about it and Republicans let them. And it absolutely drives me nuts, is there is this narrative about these loans being privatized. These are private loans. And they're not. This is a government nationalized industry, not subsidized, nationalized, like entirely so. And that, I think, is a very important point as well.
Yeah, and the point has to be made, right, Chris, is that, sure, 20 years ago, there was still a pretty big private market in student loans, but that's not the case now. So can you tell us a little bit about where these loans are coming from, who's funding them, and then kind of what the mechanism is, of how these loans encourage people to spend even more than at the colleges, and how the colleges then can get away with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing is, I think the statistics I used came from 2016, so I'm sure it's even worse now. But last I checked, it was 92% of student loan dollars were owned by the government, which means there's still some spillover of some older privatized loans. The federal government started directly issuing student loans in the 90s during the Clinton administration, and in 2010, Obama administration just kind of completed this by nationalizing it. So the actual lender is the Department of Education. I find this very amusing when people like Elizabeth Warren talk about the predatory lenders. Well, I agree they are predatory lenders, right? And so who's the predator? Well, it's the Department of Education is the predator by her own description of this program. But of course, you won't get that out of her. Or you won't get that out of Mitch McConnell either, who lets her go along with that narrative. But the Department of Education is the lender. But what they do is, of course, they have all of these, quasi-private companies like Great Lakes Borrowing Service. That's the name of one. And so they're private in the sense of like the Federal Reserve is private, which means not really. It's just a facade. But they're the ones who manage handling the payments and whatnot. So they're managing it for the Department of Education. But of course, if you're a student, you're getting these emails, you're not getting them from the Department of Education, you're getting them from Great Lakes Borrowing Service or whatever. And so it contributes to this facade of privatization that is really just an illusion. It's a problem that I think we can debate on the solution to it in terms of like student loan forgiveness or whatnot. But even before we have that debate, I think we need to understand the nature of it. And the nature of it is that these are Department of Education issued loans. You can pull up their budget. It's publicly available on their website. You can download the spreadsheet that has that in there. One point that I make is the revenue that they bring in from student loan payments every year. Last I checked, again, this might have changed by now, but the revenue that they bring in from student loan payments is about equal to the amount of loans they issue out. And so what I've advocated, and I know I'm something of a contrarian on this in the libertarian world, but what I've advocated is there's nothing against libertarian ethics that says a creditor can't forgive the loans of their lenders. So you can actually wipe out student loans without violating any private contract, but you should do this, and you should do it now, while ending the student loan program. It would be revenue neutral. This wouldn't be taxpayers supporting it. You're literally just ending the student loan program would balance out the loan forgiveness with no cost to the taxpayer, no breaking of a private contract. But you're never going to get anybody conceding that in the Democrat Party, right? What's Joe Biden doing to try to prevent this bloodletting in November that the Democrat Party knows is coming? Is he's doing this forgiveness program just to try to win over some votes, but they're not slowing down the student loan forgiveness. So all we're doing is kicking this can down the road and creating this expectation now that students can borrow and just wait for the Democrats to be in a jam, and then they'll get a little relief. And eventually this is a formula for socialized education, and we don't want that. The thing also with student loans that I think is important to understand is they aren't treated the same as private loans. So a lot of the arguments made against the student loan forgiveness are the same arguments in the 19th century that were made against bankruptcy laws. Bankruptcy laws in the first half of the 19th century were incredibly controversial, but eventually they became normal, and I don't hear many people calling for their repeal. But it was, the fairness of the creditor that was, at stake there. But bankruptcy laws don't apply to student loans. You can't bankrupt on them. So another solution might be to just allow bankruptcy on this. And you do hear some people talking about this every now and then, making student loans bankruptable. If you did that, you'd immediately have a lot of students declaring bankruptcy for their loans, because there's already a lot of them that are in default. It's a growing problem. And that's why it's so pressing. If you do the student loan forgiveness with the cancellation of the loan program, you got to do it sooner rather than later, because this idea of revenue neutrality, that's not going to last, because more people are going to go in default. Federal government's going to keep issuing, and eventually the amount they're lending out is going to be greater than the amount they're bringing in, if it's not already there, since, like I said, I'm using data from a few years ago.
Yeah, well, let's see the unemployment rate go up significantly, and then see how well the repayment goes.
Yeah, in the recession that we're not in.
Right. It's only 2/4 of decline in GDP. It's fine. It's no problem. Well, the issue here, right, is also one in which the colleges themselves benefit from the loan program. And tell us a little bit about that, right? I mean, one thing that people have noted is that the colleges, they seem really nice compared to, say, 30 years ago in terms of amenities and the new building, which never seems to stop. Where's all that money coming from? And just how much money are students bringing with them when they bring in this loan money?
It's a bit of an aside, but I can't help bringing it up as, and of course I'm a historian, so I have to spin things this way, is the continuity between the university system's history with the Catholic Church is incredibly striking to me, because it's so similar, right? The Reformation was partly largely driven by the excesses of the Catholic, all this gold ornamentation in these, people are in poverty. This is the Middle Ages. Of course, there's famine, and you have these churches adorned with all this gold ornaments and whatnot. And of course, this was becoming a problem, and this is what drove a lot of the Reformation. And the university system was born out of the church system, right? The professors were, and I think in some ways still are, clerics. The religions have changed, but the position really hasn't very much. And that's what you see now that you're referring to in this, these nice looking, ornate university buildings. It's just the same thing that we had in the 16th century, right? It's nothing has really changed. But where's that money coming from? Of course, this is mostly, obviously the federal loans are the way that the federal government subsidized the university education. They're subsidizing, through loans. And this is another point I didn't make, that can't be rejected, right? So there's no discriminating against people that are high risk of borrowing like you would have in the private credit industry. That is an important point to add to my previous one. But the states also subsidize these schools very heavily. They do so in two different ones, one through direct subsidies for state schools, obviously very common, and then also for scholarship programs. We had in Florida the Bright Futures program when I was in high school. Where I went to school in West Virginia, we had the Promise Scholarship. So these are forms of subsidies that kind of work a little bit like the student loan subsidy. The difference there is at least they're discriminating. There are usually some standards for academic performance to be able to qualify them. But the point I make, I think, in my third article about this is it's kind of the same way that bureaucracy works with budget. So my first job out of high school was for a used computer store that had a contract with the state government where they would buy government surplus, because there was a law in Florida that said you're not allowed to buy government surplus, or the government can't sell it directly on eBay. They have to sell it to a private person like my boss, who would then list it on eBay. So my job, I actually worked in the back and listed all this government surplus on eBay. And I wasn't political at all at this time. I was incognizant of all of this, but it was an early impression on me because we were getting computers in. We would get Dell computers in that were dual core processors, which was a big deal back then, right? These were top of the line computers, and they had these 3-year accidental warranties on them. They were a year old. So the government bought, and they were new in box. So the government the state government bought these $1,000 computers, put 3-year warranties on them, never opened them, and then sold them a year later to my boss on the cheap. And the reason they did this was explained to me. I would go down to the women's prison in my hometown and pick up this surplus for them a lot of times. So the reason they did this, I was told, was because you had to spend your budget or you'd lose it, right? It's the use it or lose it mentality. Now, in the private sector, there's an episode of The Office that deals with this, where there's this budget surplus, and they're deciding what to spend it on, and eventually Michael Scott returns it to the company for a bonus, right? The private sector has a mechanism to encourage thrift in a business. The government bureaucracies do not have this mechanism. They're given a budget, and if they don't spend it all, then the conclusion is, oh, you must not need it. So, of course, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to spend it. Well, that's what universities do. And so I talk in this article about these tables that we had in Marshall Classroom that nobody ever used, or at least didn't use in any way that used this function that they had, where they had a rotating crank on them that you could raise and level them. They were basically standing desks. Never once did I see a professor take advantage of this feature. Those tables cost $3,000 a piece. Now, I'm paying high tuition costs to go there so that I can see a $3,000 table that people rest their papers on in the way that you could with a $16 table that I get at Aldi's. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous, right? So it's this use it or lose it mentality. And of course, this isn't saving us money on tuition, which is the idea with these subsidies. It's actually contributing to tuition being driven up because we're just wasting all of this money instead of trying to develop more efficient policies at the university that don't undermine quality like we see in the private sector.
And of course, one of the reasons why it's important to keep, I think, that the cost of tuition high for some people is that if we can continue with your Catholic Church comparison, there is that there is degrees, I think, for a certain type of social class. It's not buying indulgences to make up for past sins, but to kind of open up special opportunities for certain people in the future. And it's very interesting right now when you see kind of this interesting dynamic where you have very much, I think, within the left, within the progressive sphere, a desire of maintaining a certain type of privileged class, using graduate classes and things like that to keep certain opportunities. I think this is particularly true within the government itself, the state itself, kind of the rotating door between academia and positions of power, whether they be officially the state or different types of kind of managerial class sort of industries out there. Also kind of connected with a kind of a larger change in the way that students are evaluated for colleges right now, where we're seeing attacks on standardized testing, right? Where we're seeing a greater emphasis placed on certain government preferred demographic groups over any sort of baseline measure of intellectual ability and things like that. And so I think this dynamic of one of the roles that colleges still play a very important role in is, again, trying to creating a very specific class of individuals, young individuals, to fill certain positions. And that itself is one of the reasons why I think particularly on the left, whereas on the right, I think there is a little bit more interest in alternatives and things like that. There still very much is that sort of entrenchment on trying to keep aspects of the traditional university system very much in place and very much important for kind of the way power really operates in this country.
That is the irony, is the university system is in many respects the most conservative institution on the planet, which also goes back to that Catholic Church continuity. It is the stickiest institution in our society, in Western society. So it is ironically an incredibly conservative institution, despite having 11% of the faculty, last I checked, identifying as conservative.
Well, that takes us to the third topic in your third article, then, is that the problem of ideological homogeneity in college. And you note, right, that the self-identification among faculty ideologically has certainly changed over time and become less diverse. There certainly seems to be a slant that one will encounter at university. And I think that if you go into university generally being skeptical of that view, you probably won't be like just converted by your professors, because lots of people go into college and come out still not having bought into everything. Some people do. But that you might learn then to engage ideas that you don't agree with if you go to college and you encounter then your typical center left or hard left views that you encounter from faculty. But if you go into college already believing that stuff, you can live for years without ever encountering any other ideas that you actually disagree with, or having to really think hard about your own ideas. And so without ideological diversity, you can get through college without ever actually thinking.
Yeah, exactly. I do agree that it's a very healthy thing to encounter ideas that you disagree with or ideas that are new to you. And that means that we have to extend that to ideas that we might disagree with, right? But when, these college professors say this, they'll repeat this platitude ad nauseum, they don't mean, I think, all students should encounter ideas they disagree with. They mean conservative students and libertarian students should encounter ideas they disagree with because they're under the wrong ideas currently, and so they need to encounter the right ideas. And that's the subtext of that platitude. But I also point out, and let me stress, I put it as ideological homogeneity because I don't think the problem is just because the universities are left dominated. If the proportions were flipped, I don't think it would be meaningfully better. And this is especially true when we look at like the research process, because a big part of the ideological homogeneity is not just the classroom experience. Of course, that's important when we're sending our kids there, but it's also the production of knowledge, the research side of things. I talk about these grievance studies professors that are pariahs now in academia. Some of them have left academia because of it. But they were raising the issue of confirmation bias in scholarship. If everybody all holds the same worldview, and you're writing things that are within that worldview, people aren't very scrutinizing about the scholarship. And it may not be conscious dishonesty. The confirmation bias doesn't work that way. It's just when somebody says something that you're already predisposed to agree with, you don't investigate it as much, right? So when you're writing in this way to an audience that 90% of them are going to agree with you by default, you have this confirmation bias in scholarship. And these grievance studies professors, they tested this by writing these absurd articles that it had fabricated citations. They just made up the names of journals. And these were absurd things about, men raping the air by sitting with their legs wide. I mentioned in the article, they published in a feminist journal something that was literally just, they rewrote passages from Mein Kampf. This is how absurd it is. They use postmodernist jargon, but they were just plugging postmodernist jargon into passages from Mein Kampf. It got published in a feminist journal, a respected one, right? This is confirmation bias to a level that is hard to, I think, conceive if you're not inside this world. And so this is a major problem. And so ideally, we would all have impartial scholars that would just rise above this. And I know many academics, many of my professors who are on the left, who are very impartial scholars. And I don't think they're the problem, even though I politically disagree with them. The problem are these scholar activists that are writing this kind of literature in the first place, and they don't have a countervailing force to kind of check their biases. And that's where the second best solution from the utopian world of perfect objectivity would be a balanced world in which you're not 90% one-sided and 10% the other side, where only that 10% has to worry very, very much about whether they're being impartial. I do this when I'm writing scholarship. I'm very scrutinizing about my impartiality because I know it's going to be read by people that disagree with my worldview. My peers on the left don't have to worry about that. The result is that worse scholarship from that group is much more likely to get attention, positive attention, than better scholarship from the ideological minority. So I'm not a conservative myself, but the way I put it in this is if the proportion were 50-50 liberal conservative, you wouldn't have this problem because both sides would have to think my anonymous peer reviewer might not agree with my worldview, so I need to make sure that I'm really scrutinizing it before I even submit it. And you don't have that in the current state of it, this current state of research.
Yeah, I think you encounter something similar in media too, where you have, it's not necessarily so much that a lot of these reporters who write these political articles are trying to necessarily exclude certain points of view. It's that they can't even fathom a world where people would have these points of view in many cases. So they've all got their favorite people that they call, and they have their idea of what's this spectrum of ideas about this thing that's going on in the world. And they're so used to a workplace and just a world in general where there's so little divergence from what their existing views are that they never break out of just that very narrow view. And so they close off, not even on purpose, all of these different avenues of investigation and avenues of inquiry, because they can't even imagine that those questions should be asked, because they've never met a person who thinks that way, or they've never read a book that says those ideas. And so, yeah, as you say, there's a real danger in that, because then It's just an echo chamber that they're all extremely well funded to just exist in, and there's no monetary downside to just cleaning house in terms of all the people that you find to be ideologically unsavory.
Yes, I agree with you, but I do want to stress that it is so much worse in academia because at least in the media, right, we do have this tendency to fall into these echo chambers. People on the left want to watch MSNBC, people on the right want to watch Fox News, and that can be a problem regardless of which side you're on. The only thing I use for news is this app on iPhone that collects headlines or collects articles from different news outlets, and it actually shows you, it has this blind spot feature that says, oh, here's what you're missing from the right, or here's what you're missing from the left on things that are overlooked. So there are avenues to this, but the difference is if I'm a conservative, I'm not forced to watch MSNBC. I can at least choose to go and watch Fox News, or I can make the choice to bounce between them. What do you do if you're a conservative or a libertarian going to a university system? Right? You got Hillsdale or Grove City, but they can only take so many students. They're small, relatively, or at least Hillsdale's relatively expensive, even by college standards. Right? It's not much of an alternative. Right? So you don't have the option to seek the balance for yourself. Right? With media, the problem is that people choose to confirm their biases by watching the news outlets that kind of fit their worldview. But in the university system, you don't even have that choice, right? You are going to be exposed to this dominating worldview, almost irrespective of where you go. Again, the rare exceptions of something like Hillsdale notwithstanding. And that's a major difference there.
Well, I think that one of the consequences too is while I think if you go into a university system with very strong ideas that may be outside of the norm of the faculty, maybe you get through there and you understand the biases and things like that. But obviously there's, I think the large percentage of the population is not political at all. And so therefore, the more time that you spend within these explicitly ideological institutions, particularly with, I think, a rising class of the more activist type scholar, if you look at politics right now, you break down the political behaviors of different groups. I mean, what is far more determinative of, voting Democrat, for example, to really just overly simplify it, is college education rates more than often, gender, more than race, more than any other socioeconomic factor, increasingly, particularly postgraduate degrees and things like that. I think this plays a big role in why you see areas like Georgia shifting more purple. We see states that see an increase in the percentage of young people that are college grads are the ones that are shifting, to bluish purple sort of styles in traditionally red areas, and unfortunately that has an inevitable shadow on any sort of reforms to this. Because I know, for example, if we go back to the student loan matter, right? If you have a political demographic that disproportionately benefits from waiving student loan payments, that is disproportionately. I mean, this is why the Biden administration is doing it, and it's also why it is fair. You're naturally going to get a pushback from Republicans on embracing something that might be practical if the biggest benefactors are those that aren't their own voters, right? And so there's a further consequence of the more that the university system has a direct impact on political behavior down the road, that necessarily complicates any attempts to politically fix some of these problems in a way that, again, while I think there's a lot of very interesting conversations going on about alternatives to higher ed, while I do think you see, perhaps a little bit of experimentation and institution building. Obviously the Mises Institute is trying to fill a small role in that with some of the programs that we offer. I still think, while everyone can agree that higher ed is a problem, I don't think that we're any closer to any serious changes now than we were, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, long before that, in part because of how much, this only further fuels a lot of the political knots that makes, doing anything more difficult to do down the road.
Well, Chris, do you see any low-hanging fruit in terms of reforms that could be made and might be even politically feasible that would make a real difference?
No, I think the best solution, this is one of the reasons I started with the first article. I don't think there's any single solution, I should say. And I think the best solution is the one that I advise parents in the first article, which is how you advise your kids. And that goes back to what I said at the very beginning of this discussion about treating work as experience and college as an economic decision. Because at the end of the day, like political change, policy change isn't impossible. And there are good policies that can potentially be implemented here, but we only have so much control over that, very, very little, right? And especially when these take place at the national level, where we have 320 million people fighting over policy, or really about half that, but the point stands. But what we do with respect to like the advice that we give our kids, that's within our control. And that's why I really wanted to start with that first article, because so much of the advice that so many parents, mine included, give their children is based on experiences that were just totally different. They were in a totally different environment. If you look at that graph I give in one of the articles on the ideological homogeneity on the self-report studies, you'll notice that around in the 80s, following the 60s and 70s, when there was a highly polemical period like there is now, at the 80s, you actually see a nearly equal representation of liberal and conservative self-reporting from faculty members. Part of that is because there was a backlash against this, especially among donors. And this is another reason why state subsidies are problematic, because they prevent this mechanism of just stop donating. But there was a roughly equal representation. And so in the 80s and 90s, universities were less polemical. And a lot of the people advising their kids about college today, that's the environment they went to school in. And this is also before student loans were nationalized, right? So the student loans they were dealing with were much smaller. Tuition was much smaller. Back in the 70s, you could have a part-time job to pay for tuition. You can't do that anymore. So a lot of parents are giving their children very well-meaning advice that would have been good 40 years ago, and it's not today. And we shouldn't wait for the next generation to have these bad experiences before this is corrected. And so this is part of what I want to do. Is the best thing I think we can do this is my individualism coming out, is just how we advise our children. And that's very much why I wanted to start with that cultural article. That's so much more important, I think, than the policy changes. When students stop going to school and majoring in things like gender studies, or even just, things even like biology, my friend that couldn't get a job, right? When they stop going to school and getting these degrees that they can't get jobs with, reform will happen even without politics, right? Because universities can be subsidized all day long, but they got to have students.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and let that be the last word on this episode of Radio Rothbard. We'll be back next week for another episode. Thank you to Chris for joining us today, and thanks to Tho, my co-host, and we'll see you next time.